Today on BRS TV, we're going to redistribute BRS profits and send them to a more worthy cause. Hi, I'm Ryan, your host of BRS TV, where each week we cover a new topic related to reefing. This week we're going to give an enormous amount of cash to a worthy cause. No, not you, but the Aquatics Defunds Fund at PJAC. For the next 2 days, February 23rd and 24th, we're going to donate 10% of Bulk Reef Supply's total sales to PJAC to help support and protect our hobby. If you like, you can check out their site and make your own personal donation, but we'd like to support that by raising a solid contribution here as well. We also partnered with 3 of the industry's most trusted and respected brands in Ecotech, Vertex, and Aqualuminations, which are all going to match our 10%, so a total of 20% of any Ecotech, Vertex, and Aqualumination purchases for the next 2 days goes directly to PJAC. Overall, we expect to produce a donation in the tens of thousands to PJAC in the next 2 days, but you can help maximize these efforts with your support by maybe making that purchase you were planning on anyways in the next 2 days. For those of you that are unaware, PJAC is fighting a large group of lobbyists who are aggressively trying to put many of the corals and fish in your tank on the endangered species list, which means you not only couldn't buy them any longer, but you'd also have to get rid of what's in your tank and destroy it, or risk violating federal law and some pretty crazy fines or worse. What's concerning is how worthless the guesses and ridiculous science these lobbyists are using for their cause. Even more concerning is how many of the lobbyists don't care about the ocean or its inhabitants at all, and this is really just a way to generate an income in some pretty crazy ways. We're going to close today's video with a great presentation from this year's MACNA by Julian Sprung, which covers the proposed Endangered Species Act and all of this in great detail, with some really interesting points that will absolutely shock you. We thank all the members of the BRS reefing community for your support, Ecotech, Vertex, and AI for joining us in this endeavor, and we look forward to announcing in a couple days how much money the community was able to raise for PJAC. If you'd like to make your own donation or learn more about the Aquatic Defense Fund, check out pjac.org/ADF. I hope you enjoyed Julian's fantastic presentation and the interesting light that he sheds on this important topic.
Good afternoon, you guys. I hope you guys are enjoying MACNA very well. We've had powerhouse after powerhouse speaker here in this room this afternoon. I've thoroughly enjoyed them and I see a lot of talks, but now we're going to change gears and talk about something that's really, really important. Julian Sprung, man who needs no introduction, is going to introduce us into the Endangered Species Act listing of stony corals. And he's going to just talk for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to transform the stage, bring the other table up here, and bring up some of the people who are working on this against this particular listing and have a roundtable discussion. So, Julian, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jake, and I want to say that this has really been a wonderful MACNA. I've enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody here has so far. Those of you who attended MACNA last year and saw my lecture on this same subject understand how serious a subject this really is. I mean, to boil it down to a bottom line, we really are talking about the potential loss of our hobby. Now, somebody might look at the subject of ESA listing of corals, and then the subject there is, hey, we're talking about conserving corals. That is an important subject too, but I am here talking to you about the seriousness of how quickly you could lose the right to maintain corals in your aquariums. Let's see. Well, it worked a moment ago. There we go. Show of hands. How many here, you can read what I have there, how many support conservation of wildlife and preservation of the natural environment? I think I see everybody. If you don't have your hands up, it's not a trick question. Okay? Trust me. And if an animal is threatened or endangered in the wild, would you support listing it for protection under the U.S. Endangered Species Act? Okay. Now, do you agree with this statement? I prefer to buy tank-raised marine life because it reduces pressures on the natural reef. Most of you would agree with that statement. We'll get back to that one later. I bring up these questions because My fellow aquarists, we have a real public image problem. You know, all of you know, that you are conservation-minded people. And you may believe that all you need to do is prove that to the rest of the world, but I'm sorry, you can't. It's impossible. Perceptions don't change. Look at how powerful words affect what you see. This is an ad from the bank HSBC, and if you travel a lot, you see these on the jetway. And I love them. You know me, I love advertising. Style, soldier, survivor. How does that affect your emotion when you look at that picture? Think about how people's emotions affect them when they see that you're taking something from the wild and putting it in an aquarium, in a cage. You can put yourself in their shoes and say, you know, are they right? Or is what we're doing wrong? Trust me, I'm not up here admonishing you. I support the aquarium industry. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool aquarist. Okay? I'm just trying to bring up the perception. We have an uphill battle. And the words there were privilege, sacrifice, and role model. So, is this man destroying an endangered reef or just maintaining his aquarium? It's all a matter of what you see. That's Joe Waiulo in his aquarium, and he needs to do that. He's got to break up the corals once in a while. What is this guy doing? That's Acropora cervicornis, a threatened coral under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. Well, I'll tell you what they're doing. These corals, these large corals that you see there, were raised on a farm created by the Coral Restoration Foundation, and they're studying these corals. They collected them at this time of year when they spawn. So they brought these farmed colonies into the lab and they collected the gametes. That's a lot of words. Much easier to say this and believe it. So one more. How about this one? How many of you have coral gravel in your aquarium? Is it coral gravel or is it endangered corals? I know somebody who went to jail for almost 2 years over this U.S. government. And there were articles in the news. You can find them. You Google it online. He had 40 tons of endangered corals. That sounds really bad. So, coral reef conservation, will the Center for Biological Diversity and NOAA undo 30 years of progress? And I refer to the progress that we as aquarists have made in figuring out how to mass propagate corals and keep them alive in captivity. You know that we love corals. All of you know it. I don't need to preach to the choir. We look at this scene and we say, you know, that's a coral reef, but no, it's a coral reef aquarium. Tropical reef corals pre-1985. This is a UNEP map. Here we are today. They've already moved inland. Well, we know how they've done that. Is it too much of a stretch to imagine that corals love us too? I should mention that this concept is something that comes from a lengthy conversation I had with a friend of mine, Colin Ford. Many of you know of him in Miami. And this concept of coral consciousness is a little bit esoteric, but it's interesting to think about. Center for Biological Diversity, they petitioned NOAA in October of 2009 to list 83 reef-building corals for protection under the Endangered Species Act. Their main focus was climate change, the threat of climate change, and how it would affect ocean acidification and increase in coral diseases and whatnot. So there's a whole process when a petitioner petitions the U.S. government to list species under the Endangered Species Act. In this case, NOAA followed the whole process of public review and they formed also their own biological review team. You'll see other reference to it. That's the BRT. And they produced 2 reports, a coral status review and a coral management report. You can find them online if you Google search those. They were made available for public comment in 2012. And there were changes that ended up with NOAA publishing a proposed rule to list 59 species of Pacific corals, 7 as endangered, 52 as threatened, and 7 Caribbean corals, 5 as endangered, 2 as threatened, and there's the URL where you can read about that. They had proposed to change the status of elkhorn and staghorn coral from threatened to endangered. Now, there is a legal process that must be followed to allow for these changes to occur, to allow a species to be listed. There is required species-specific analysis, and the National Marine Fisheries Service did not conduct the required species-specific analysis. They really couldn't because the information wasn't there. So instead, they utilized a screening tool that weighed generalized information. And bottom line, they basically used opinion. So in the absence of species-specific abundance and information about their trends of how they're surviving or not, the BRT members relied heavily upon basically best available information, which didn't exist. And they were looking at the likely impacts of global warming, ocean acidification. So this is a quote from NOAA themselves. They basically said, you know, the lack of adequate information on the complex coral ecology and interactions between threats made the assessment of extinction risk for each of the species extremely challenging and uncertain. They admitted it back then that they really didn't know what to do. So what they did is they created this tool, which is here. I don't know. This is where they have the data gathered from that tool. These are the numbers, right, Marshall? So, you know, bottom line is the arrows all point to yes, yes, yes list. It's very, very arbitrary. So their team's method are really not science-based. They lack data, so basically they're guessing. So here we are today for MACNA. A couple of days ago, August 28th, the final corals listing was published. So NOAA listed 20 corals as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. There were 2 other corals, elkhorn and staghorn coral, were already listed as threatened. They remain unchanged. So now there's 22 species affected. Here they are. Those of you in the front row can see how this affects us in the trade. Basically, they went across, let's see. What is going to give me the red light? There we go. A broad range of species. They've got several acropora here. Well, these are the Caribbean corals here, so that doesn't affect us. Several acropora. They've got Euphyllia paradivisa. These are clearly corals. This affects us in our trade. You have a Montipora, you've got Pavona, you've got Parietes, and Seriatopora. So when you consider from a farming point of view, from a hobby point of view, you've touched upon a lot of different genera, and that's a key point. I'm going to go the wrong way. Here we go. The final this is a quote from the announcement from NOAA. The final decision is a significant change from the proposed rule in November 2012. In other words, there's by far fewer species listed and none listed as endangered. Yay, right? Okay, you might think this is great. Well, you know, ideally they shouldn't have listed any. Now, it's really curious that they made this statement because they didn't even need to make the statement. It's kind of NOAA talking to us. We changed our determinations for many of the species for 2 general reasons. We received and gathered new general and species-specific information. What they are telling the general public, and specifically us, is that after the comment period was over, after the legal requirement they got information that made them change their minds. And you know why that happened? It happened because we as an industry, PJAC as an organization, the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council, worked with Charlie Veron. Everybody knows who Charlie Veron is, Corals of the World, and submitted data basically showing them how wrong they were. Public comments helped us refine the way we apply all available information. Sure, they gathered public information, but the main issue was after all that was done, they got this, results of an update of the Corals of the World information base for the listing determination of 66 coral species under the Endangered Species Act. Here's a comment from my email in discussion with Charlie Veron about this subject before he prepared that. My name appears on every second page of the NOAA document. I've repeatedly told them that their data is about 15 years out of date and is riddled with mistakes. Even a year ago, they were on an unchangeable path. So our website will be launched around the same time as their new concoction and will sharply disagree with it. It's a long story and yet another slab of mindless bureaucracy. He was pretty fed up with it, and he was not alone. This is the leading coral guy in the world, and there were many coral people who said, this is nonsense. So what happens next? From the NOAA fact sheet that was published just a couple of days ago, they make this statement. In the future, we may also identify specific regulations for the conservation of these threatened species because ESA prohibitions against take are not automatically applied as they are for species listed as endangered. Basically, the door is open for them to decide whatever they want to do. We will now work with our partners on mitigation measures and recovery strategy for the newly listed corals, building from approaches that have shown success elsewhere. I think what they're hinting at there is permitting. So basically, allowing people who are already doing good things to conserve corals to continue doing so if they apply for a permit. Right? So coral species listed as threatened will be legal to possess, trade, and sell. That means for you guys, for now. Who knows how long? NOAA has the option of allowing trade for species listed as threatened. The option. They also have the option to grant each of the corals the full protections afforded by endangered species status. The process could take years, but their subsequent decisions basically could end our hobby and end the trade of corals, business and hobby. So how good are you guys at identifying corals to species? Right. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they're the ones who allow the corals to come in, whether they are wild caught or farm raised. They probably feel the same way as you about identification. So the ESA has this little section, similarity of appearance provisions of the Endangered Species Act. Bottom line is, if it looks like an endangered species, it's an endangered species. So all you got to do, I showed that list, all you needed was one acropora and then no more acropora. All you needed was one euphilia, no more euphilia. You get the point? So maybe you think the aquarium industry just needs to prove that it's a sustainable thing and everything's going to be all right. I've heard people say that and argue that point, but you're wrong. So what it's really about is not the sustainability of the aquarium hobby. It's about greenhouse gases. It's about using corals as the ability to change policies globally concerning greenhouse gases. And most of us are on the side of changing policies regarding greenhouse gases. We want to be conservation-minded. But you have to be careful what you wish for. So Attorney Brendan Cummins from the CBD, that's the Center for Biological Diversity, said that without a national legal mechanism for regulating greenhouse gases, the CBD has turned to the Endangered Species Act. They're utilizing it as a tool. I want to mention, what protection do corals really not have? Think about it. CITES, all sorts of national parks and zones around the world protecting reefs and corals. And how has that protected them? This is a hands-off policy. It's failed. We wouldn't be here if it worked, right? So what does ESA do? It provides more hands-off. As you know, Albert Einstein had this statement about insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I just say that hands-off is the wrong way. We all know it. I'm preaching to the choir. And so ESA provisions really make the problem for recovery of corals worse, of course, because the way to, and incidentally, Section 9 of the ESA prohibits take, and take means not only just removal, but any harm, any touching, any damage. And that includes commerce. You cannot sell. The regulations that are likely coming down the line is that you, as a farmer or a hobbyist, would not be able to take the corals that you grow and transport them across state lines. Just not going to be doable. What is take? I just mentioned that. So I don't need to go on. But I said hands-on works. There's many different ways hands-on works. Coral Restoration Foundation, Sea Corps, and all these things are subject to, at risk from this happening. ORA and other inland farms, all this growing of coral. This can be utilized as ways to protect corals as endangered species. But with ESA protections involved, these activities will all become illegal. Biorock in Indonesia and elsewhere, reef balls. These are all activities of reef restoration that involve aquarium techniques for mass propagating corals. So permitting, well, NOAA likes to, as so many agencies regulating the environment like to do, issue permits. So this was back last year. A final listing determination is expected. Well, now we've had it. And so they were encouraging people to apply for a permit before the listing determination because, you know, it could take a while to get your permit. So before they actually made the rule, they told you, basically, it's coming, and hurry up and apply. This is classic compliance techniques. If you've ever read this book, Influence, by Robert Cialdini, I really highly recommend it. So that statement, we encourage you to apply for a permit before the listing determination. This is like a sales tactic. Hurry up, buy it now while it's on sale. So we tend to demonize people. This is common. We think of us versus them. So looking at our enemies, right? It's easy to imagine them as monsters. So who are the CBD, the Center for Biological Diversity? You're probably thinking these are eco-conscious people in their loafers driving their Prius. Tree huggers? No, sorry. They're just a bunch of lawyers. And lawyers can be nice people, don't get me wrong, but I just want to point out that these are not just eco-conscious people, it's an organization of lawyers. So this was a terrific statement from one of our own, Craig Watson, director of the University of Florida Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. He just pointed out that if the predictions on climate change used in the petition from the CBD, their predictions are accurate, then there's very little life on the planet that you could not say was endangered. It's a good point. And the flip side is to say that, you know, if they are successful in this drive to use the Endangered Species Act to curb greenhouse gas emissions by protecting corals, they really weaken the Endangered Species Act. They make it pointless. So will our hobby and industry have a future? Will there be a MACNA in a couple of years? I don't know. I also want to point out there's many user groups of reefs, aquarium industry, hobbyists and people in the industry, public aquariums, dive industry, underwater photography industry, all the academic coral reef researchers in universities, and then nonprofit coral reef restoration people, NGO, government agencies. I just hope that we can get together and not be fighting ourselves. I think it's important. I think it's important as hobbyists to think about my first questions to you in the beginning of the talk. This whole idea that wild collection is a bad thing. I think it's important to recognize that wild collection is part of reef conservation. And I think it's also important to recognize that mariculture and aquaculture, whether it happens there or here, are also good things. But nothing should be in exclusivity. It should all be allowed. And we need to bear that in mind and not demonize one or the other. They're all good. Now, can there be improvements? I think so. There are perhaps certain species of fishes or corals that could stand some looking at, review, improvement on collection quantities, sizes, whatnot. But I think we're pretty good even right now. Fraggers and farmers, thinking that your activities are safe from these regulations is simply wrong. And thinking that banning wild collection is a good thing that would benefit your profit is wrong. You're going to lose your hobby and your business if you don't pay attention to this now. We need to stand together and support each other. We need to look and support PJAC, the Marine Ornamental Committee and Defense Fund that PJAC set up really made a huge difference that I showed you there, and employing Charlie Veron especially. So what can you do on this subject? I recommend look at pjac.org/marine. You as individuals, your dealers, talk to your store, write to MASNA. I'm sure there's representatives of MASNA here. I think MASNA could be involved in supporting PJAC. And manufacturers like myself, I as a manufacturer of Too Little Fishy support PJAC. There's other manufacturers here who do and some who don't. I think it's a good idea for everybody to be involved because this is coming. And there's more. Many of you know about Snorkel Bob and his group in Hawaii, fighting the aquarium industry. It's related. There's also Wild Earth Guardians. They've petitioned NOAA. So there's, in addition to the 22 species listed as threatened, there's 3 more that are proposed down the pike, and most likely they'll be listed too. Oh, they even are trying to have Nemo listed as endangered. Oh, but wait a minute, don't we culture those? Doesn't matter. Okay. So apparently from this list, 3 are being considered by NOAA for addition. So now I will turn the table to our panel of experts on this subject. I covered a broad general view. We have Marshall Myers here from PJAC, who can give us a lot more detail on the legal strategy for our industry. It's looking like there's going to be a lawsuit, and so contributions to PJAC are helpful in supporting the cost of that legal action. We have Chris Berner from Quality Marine, Kevin Cohen from Doctors Foster and Smith, and Dustin Dorton from ORA. Each will be able to provide some additional perspective. I certainly don't cover every topic. Thank you.
Okay, bear with us for just a couple of minutes while we transform the stage to do the roundtable, and we'll get our panel of experts up here.
I'm Chris Berner, the owner and president of Quality Marine Los Angeles. Some of you may be familiar with our company. We're a large livestock distributor in North America, and we are members of PJAC. And as this action gained some steam, we identified the need to pull together a group of like-minded companies and begin discussing the potential impacts that these petitions might have on the industry. And we've talked a little bit about the initial 83 species petition that was filed by CBD. And to Julian's point, it's a group of lawyers. It's a group of 70 lawyers. So, I mean, I think the organization's 90 strong, 70 of whom are attorneys. Over the past 7, 8 years, they've clawed back $2 or $3 million $9 million in fees that there's a little known tool whereby environmental warfare groups, and these are sort of law firms, that file petition after petition to the government who doesn't have the resources to handle these petitions in a timely manner. There's a fund whereby these groups can claw back their own legal expenses. So the government doesn't have enough taxpayer money to handle the petitions, but the taxpayer money goes into this fund whereby these petitioners can claw back their time. So you can imagine the billable hours that 70 attorneys can generate. It's pretty sick. So we saw this petition come, and then pretty quickly thereafter, there was a petition to list 52 species of clownfish and damselfishes, some other finfishes. There was another petition that was introduced by Wild Earth Guardians to again list some additional corals and some species that we currently culture in big numbers, things like, of course, Ocellaris, Banggai cardinal. And we see the writing on the wall, and that writing says, if they get a few of these through successfully under the proxy of climate change, then everything in the sea could be listed. Technically, everything on Earth could be listed. And this just sounds fantastical, but if you think about it, the Endangered Species Act is pretty clear in its description. For a species to be qualified, there has to be a 30% reduction in population over a 30-year period throughout all or a significant portion of its range. So it's meant for like protecting a tiger or a lion. You fly into the jungle with a helicopter, you count the tigers, go back 30 years later and go, oh, wow, there's 30% less. This qualifies for ESA protection, and it should. But there's a couple qualifications. One is you had to know how many there were 30 years ago, and you have to know how many there are now. And they can't even tell one coral species from another, especially when they're snorkeling across the surface of the water looking for corals at who knows what depth. It's an impossibility to quantify the population then or now. So they have to use a proxy of climate change and a sort of a anecdotal evidence. Well, we think global reef coverage has been declining by a rate of 30% over the past 30 years. So likely all the species that inhabit the coral reefs are suffering similar declines in their population. And that's really the premise for these listing petitions. They're coming hot and heavy now. And if they're successful at petitioning a few corals, then they can begin to petition coral after coral, species after species, food fish, fin fish, aquarium fish. It's all fair game. So obviously we're not the only industry that's affected by this. There are other industries that are equally concerned. And so we found an opportunity to really sort of study these issues, pull together a panel to explore how our trade might be affected, and decide to do something about it. And so we raised some money a couple years ago. We've continued to raise money over the last 2 years. And we, as Julian suggested, we reached out to some people, experts, whom NOAA cited repeatedly throughout this process as being experts. And I've had additional communication that suggested they've picked some of the most widely distributed species on the planet to suggest are endangered. And there's really nothing we can do about this, but compel them to consider the most current and relevant and available information that we can find. In many cases, we have to produce that information, and we have countless members of the scientific community that are up in arms about this decision. And again, something that Julian made, and I'll hand off the mic, was that this misuse of ESA, applying it where it isn't valid, where it's been so problematic in its administration, undermines the validity of what I believe is an important act, protecting a species that needs protecting. In this case, they've listed countless species that are being aquacultured by the hundreds of thousands in countries like Indonesia, in Fiji, and in Tonga, and throughout the Pacific, and in Florida, and in California, and in your aquariums. These are species that aren't endangered. They aren't even threatened, but they've decided to list those. And if you think about the concept of species identification and the job that U.S. Fish and Wildlife is meant to do to inspect every shipment and determine what's being imported in accordance with a CITES permit, that job becomes very, very hard. And then when you have slight differentiation in morphology from one species to the next, the conclusion is often, let's not allow importation of any of these species. And so you have entire genera that are just wiped out. from trade, not just from importation, but from domestic commerce or even ownership. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Marshall, and he can expound further on that. Everyone here in the room is affected by this. We obviously, as industry participants, are dramatically affected by this, and you as hobbyists or other industry participants are affected by this as well.
The only thing I wanted to add was Julian did make mention of a permitting process. I think that in order to get a permit to work with these corals, it's going to have to be something that's going to lead towards the conservation or preservation of corals. So something like the work that the Coral Restoration Foundation is doing or Seacor, that's a pretty clear survival in the wild type conservation move. But propagating corals in a greenhouse in Florida for sale in the aquarium industry is not really likely to be viewed as a conservation oriented type decision. So there is a permitting process that would be allowed for, but I think let's not get our hopes up too high that that's going to somehow continue to allow the trade in even aquacultured corals. Marshall.
Well, I think Chris Berner and Julian both, as well as Dustin, have alluded to how serious this issue is, and from a company standpoint, for my company, Foster and Smith, we've really supported PJAC and have really put a lot of money towards the Marine Ornamental Subcommittee here, and it's somewhat disappointing to me that a lot of my peers and a lot of hobbyists as well haven't really supported PJAC in this initiative, and I really encourage everybody here. I know a lot of flyers got passed around about how we can financially support as a group and as hobbyists this initiative here with PJAC, and I would really encourage everybody to really read that flyer well. Go to your local pet store, your Reef Club, and let's really all work together so that we can fight these bogus legislative issues and really come together as a trade. So I'll hand it off to Marshall.
As a preliminary comment, the flyer illustrates a lot of different activities, not just corals. Over the last year, Hawaii tried 14 different pieces of legislation to shut down the Hawaiian trade. So this is a big issue. It's not going away, and this is just the very beginning of what's going to be, I think, a long ordeal. Chris wanted me to bring out that one of the issues with this whole listing is that the outgoing administrator at NOAA, her claim to fame when she returned to Stanford, as I recall, was that she wanted corals listed. This is a political decision. This is a decision that both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill are furious about. And when we had a Coral Reef Task Force meeting in Washington, interesting, none of the NGOs, I was the only non-government person who appeared, but the governor from Guam was there, officials from American Samoa, from the Virgin Islands, all saying, listen to what Charlie Veron says, because you have this totally wrong. Now, one of the things that I think you have to understand, and while Dustin referred to permits, some of those permits you have to renew them every year, if you can get them at all. And if it takes you over a year to get a permit, Lord knows what the renewal permit would be. I think that the notice that went out by NOAA was the most non-ingenuous notice I've ever seen a government agency put out. They led you to believe that this could be years before anything's going to happen. Under the statute, they have to do something if it's listed as threatened. They will not have as much time, and I will guarantee you that CBD and others will be filing lawsuits to speed up that process. They will push it. Another interesting thing about the notice is it will become effective 30 days after it's published in the Federal Register, which we expect will probably be next Tuesday or Wednesday. They also are providing a 60-day comment period for people to contact them about whether or not they should what they would include in what's called a 4D rule. That's the exception that would allow the take of these corals to promote conservation. And take would include every coral that's in a fragger's tank, stuff that's already here in the United States, or stuff being imported from outside of the country. It would affect the mariculture operations in Indonesia, Fiji, anywhere in the world that they're going on. So the 4D rule has been held out to a lot of people as being sort of the panacea about how we will step up and help you continue your trade. We have grave doubts that that will occur. We also question if not CBD and the others will be in there challenging anything they do. The other thing they've done with this notice on the 60-day comment period on the 4D rule is how will they have climate change be part of that discussion? Because climate change is this administration's position on doing everything. Everything will be regulated. And it's interesting, there was a proposal to list some Alaskan corals, which NOAA threw out for the same reasons we oppose this listing. They are making this, while the law says they have to have abundance data, they are making these listings based on a lack of abundance data. They threw out the Alaskan coral issue, and only a few weeks ago, in a case involving polar bears in Alaska, they took a real hit for the lack of science. So what we're going to see, we suspect, will be several court challenges. The petroleum industry is concerned, the jewelry industry is concerned, steamship industry, because technically at one of the proposals, it could have shut down the Port of Honolulu. And because a ship going over the corals with any discharge or drops an anchor is in violation of the Act. A violation of the Act can carry very serious consequences. There are both civil and criminal penalties under the Endangered Species Act, and you also can be hit with Lacey Act violations on top of it, and these are felonies if they want to really get tough. So this is not something that people should sit back lightly and think, oh well, I can continue to do this because I already have this in my possession. This is a far-reaching decision. It has a lot of concern on Capitol Hill about being too far-reaching. And so I think that all of us have to be cognizant of the fact that we may have a multi-group of lawsuits being filed. We're in the process of making that decision probably within the next week. We are coordinating with other like-minded trade organizations because what we want is good science that is valid science and not relying on papers that are not peer-reviewed or just popular type articles, gray literature. So this is an issue for all of us, and I think it'd probably be best if we sort of had people ask us questions.
I wanted Dustin to make an example of
Yeah, and that'd be very good, Dustin, because that'd be an excellent example.
I think so far we've been talking about this in kind of a bigger, broader scale. And one of the, I think if we focus on just one species in the listing, we can kind of maybe get a little bit of a picture of just how flawed the decision making was. One of the species that really stuck out to me was Acropora locani. I think a lot of us keep that in our aquariums. It's really commonly grown in Indonesia. And that actually made it on the initial one of the early lists as is potentially endangered, and that kind of caught our attention. So we looked at the data that they had compiled for that coral and how it made it into the listing to begin with, and it's almost humorous how crazy it is. It made it into the listing process in the beginning because it was identified in a photograph that was taken in American Samoa, which meant that it existed in American waters. But it turned out that it was an improper identification because I think it's the first version of Veron's Corals of the World had the wrong coral picture printed on the page for locani. So it was included in error to begin with. But I guess to save face, I just decided to leave it in anyways, even though it didn't exist in U.S. waters anywhere. So when they compiled the data under the biological review team, they looked at 5 different threats for the corals. They looked at thermal stress, ocean acidification, disease, predation, and land-based sources of pollution. So to summarize their findings for each of those areas, for thermal stress, they said that there's no species-specific data for locani and its susceptibility to thermal stress. For acidification, they said there's no species-specific research. For disease, they said not known. For predation, they said poorly known. Land-based sources of pollution was largely unknown. And the summary for the species says the overall wide range of votes for The overall wide range of votes reflects the uncertainty among BRT members inherent in the lack of adequate ecological and demographic information for Acropora locani. So they outright say that they have no information, but it's still managed to stay on the list, and we don't really know why. So.
You know, also Julian alluded to the biological review team, and I forget what their tool was called. Marshall's holding a giant version of it here. But essentially, you've got 5 guys on a panel like we have here, 2 of whom might be coral ecologists and experts, 1 who might be a conservationist and know nothing about coral ecology, 2 others that also didn't have any information or experience in coral ecology. And I'm not making this up. There were 5 experts on the biological review team, 2 of whom were coral ecologists, and 2 of whom had some other expertise. They all look at the information that they have in front of them for things like Acropora cervicornis or palmata. We've been studying that off the coast of Florida for decades. They've got reams and reams and reams of information, voluminous data, and they can all draw a pretty conclusive conclusion as to about its sort of status. And then they all vote what its extinction risk might be. And that one voted, I think, I got a score of 64 if I recall. Then they take something like Acropora locani, about which there's nothing written, and it achieves the same score. And you wonder, what's the scoring? How does the scoring work? Well, Julian's a coral expert, and he goes, that stuff's all over the place. Every ocean I've been diving in, I've seen it everywhere. They're growing millions of corals in Indo. That thing's not even close to being extinct. 0 chance. I'm gonna give that a 0. Dustin goes, that thing's a little hard to keep. It's sometimes that thing's a little susceptible to bleaching. It's a low score, 20. I'm a hardcore conservationist. Protect them all, 100. Marshall's a conservationist. Protect them all, 80. The average score, if it's more than 50, list it. If it's less than 50, don't. I kid you not, that was the process. And if that doesn't piss you guys off like it pissed me off, I don't know what else to describe about this entire broken process. And unfortunately, this is a political football that's being advanced down the field, by various administrations. And again, they don't care about the aquarium trade. We're meaningless. They risk us they rate us as a very, very, very low risk to coral extinction. But obviously, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, ocean acidification, et cetera, these are all high risks, and they deem that in time, the global coral reef coverage is gonna shrink because of this. Of course, we have more recent information from the scientific community that illustrates that corals are actually quite adaptable to higher levels of acidity. So they can survive well in lower pH water. They change, they adapt. We know this also. Corals change morphology in warmer and warmer water. So there are all kinds of things to suggest that lots of coral species that we have concerns about will live on into another millennia in a different form. So this is all very, 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 very loose, rough science that's being employed here. And the scientific community, for the most part, is up in arms about this, as are we, because it really affects all of our hobbies and livelihoods. This is for real.
One point you mentioned the scientific community. We were approached by some academics who very honestly said, we live off of NOAA grants. So subpoena us and we'll tell the truth. That's the situation we're dealing with. So the next 6 months to 2 years are going to be a very interesting time for your hobby. And Walt Locani, I understand, are from Fiji. So, we all have this battle to do together. We have to fight for good science, and if science can come up and show that a particular species warrants listing, then we have to support it. But we also, I think, have an obligation to oppose, rather, bad science. And that's where we're at today.